Good evening and welcome to Israel Policy Forum's second annual Joseph Forum. I'm Susie Gelman, chair of the board of the Israel Policy Forum, and I really want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Israel Policy Forum is an organization committed to preserving Israel's future as Jewish, democratic, and secure. We are committed to educating policymakers and community leaders on pragmatic approaches to advancing a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a manner that enhances Israel's security, and we seek to shape the discourse accordingly. At present, as you undoubtedly all know or appreciate, our mission is being challenged by those who would rather pursue unrealistic supposed alternatives that would fail to provide either Israel or the Palestinians with the security, independence, and dignity that both peoples deserve. Some of these alternatives, such as partial or total annexation of the West Bank, yes, these are serious matters under discussion in Israel today, would spell the end of the Zionist dream and would force Israel to be either Jewish or democratic, but no longer both. Israel Policy Forum supports the goal of a two-state solution because it is the only way to achieve the vision of a secure Jewish and democratic Israel. That same vision inspired Israel's founders in establishing the Jewish state 70 years ago, which we will celebrate in May. Tonight, at this year's Joseph Forum, we will discuss the vision of Israel's most accomplished leaders, the present challenges, and what the future may hold. Each year, the Joseph Forum aims to be a platform for a different kind of dialogue, one that educates us, yet challenges our assumptions in a constructive discourse with leading analysts, officials, and scholars. This program is convened in honor of our chairman emeritus, Peter Joseph, who, as many of you know, loves a good, engaging discussion that makes us think, that provokes us, and that urges us to think about leadership in new and different ways. Tonight's program is a perfect reflection of these attributes. Prime Ministers David Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, and Yitzhak Rabin have been the three most consequential leaders in Israel's 70-year history. Ben-Gurion shepherded the establishment of the Jewish state and was the father of the nation, lovingly referred to as the old man. Begin upended the Israeli political map, but also led the state to an historic peace with Egypt. Rabin demonstrated both bold leadership to seek a realistic peace with the Palestinians, established peace with Jordan, and ultimately sacrificed his life for peace. It is Rabin who inspired the creation of our organization, the Israel Policy Forum. As we work to overcome the current challenges to a lasting peace, this program is an opportunity to recall the history of the Zionist dream, how far it has come, and how far it still can and must go to ensure that the vision of a secure, Jewish, and democratic state is one which will be realized for many, many generations to come. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight and for your support and participation in the work ahead. Im tirtzu enzo agada. If you will it, it is no dream. I would now like to turn over the floor to my predecessor and this program's namesake, Peter Joseph, to introduce this evening's most distinguished guests. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Susie, and thank you to all of you who really honor me with your presence here this evening. I'm very pleased to be making it to my first Joseph Forum. And yes, I've been drinking a lot of water. That's for my wife, wherever she is. I am particularly pleased that David Halperin and IPF came up with the concept of this evening's discussion. As Susie mentioned, and as many of you know, I've always maintained my warm embrace of the State of Israel through an intellectual engagement with its history, sociology, and politics. And IPF has served as a powerful instrument in furtherance of that engagement. IPF's clear and pragmatic approach to Israel's national security and economic and political stability have provided an opportunity for all of its members to gain a greater understanding of these issues. As Israel approaches its 70th anniversary, it plays out many of the 21st century's most challenging concerns as it wrestles with both its democratic values and its Jewish character. Probably one of the most exciting characteristics of my identity as an American and as an American Jew is my ability to immerse myself in an informed conversation with my community and its future generation, my children, about achieving our social goals, often through the lens of the State of Israel. IPF has brought together this evening some of the most widely recognized scholars of Israel's history. I'll call you a scholar tonight, if I may. And who are renowned for their ability to bring their learning to the public discourse. So I'll try to be quick, but these resumes are pretty lengthy, so bear with me. Daniel GORDIS is a Senior Vice President and Koret Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College, the author of more than 10 books. GORDIS is a regular columnist for both the Jerusalem Post and Bloomberg View. He's written the biography of Menachem Begin, which we'll hear about this evening, entitled Menachem Begin, The Battle for Israel's Soul. His newest book is a history of the State of Israel, entitled Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn, which received the 2016 National Jewish Book Award as Book of the Year. Our old friend, Ambassador ITAMAR RABINOVICH, is the president of the Israel Institute, Israel's former ambassador to the United States and former chief negotiator with Syria in the mid-1990s. He is also, of course, the former president, as you know, of Tel Aviv University, and a current professor emeritus of Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv, a distinguished global professor here in New York at New York University, and a distinguished fellow at Brookings Institute, where I see him at the Saban Forum on a regular basis. He's the vice chairman of the Institute for National Security Studies, an external institute of Tel Aviv University, and a senior research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center. Rabinovich is the author of 6 books on modern history and politics of the Middle East, including his most recent book, which we focus on this evening, Yitzhak, Rabin, Soldier, Leader, Statesman, which won the Gold Book Prize from the Washington Institute in 2017. And finally, the slacker in the crowd, Professor ANITA SHAPIRA, is a world-renowned historian, Professor Emerita of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University, and a founder, or the founder, of the Yitzhak Rabin Center for Israel Studies. She specializes in the history of Zionism, the Jewish community in Palestine, the State of Israel, with an emphasis on cultural, social, and intellectual history. She's published numerous books, including, as we've heard, Ben Gurion, the founder of Israel, in 2014. Professor SHAPIRA has received numerous academic and professional awards and fellowships from Israeli and foreign universities, including Yale, a few places you've heard of, Stanford, Oxford, Columbia, and others. 2008, she was awarded the Israel Prize for Jewish History. And recently she won the National Jewish Book Award for her book, which my family knows I spent a lot of time poring over, Israel, a History. The Washington Institute for Middle East Studies Silver Award for her biography of David Ben-Gurion, and the Lifetime Achievement Award for Israel Studies from the Association of Israel Studies and the Israel Institute. And finally, to really keep our evening going here, our close friend NATAN SACHS from Brookings. He's a fellow and director of their Center Middle East Policy, where his work focuses on Israeli foreign policy, domestic politics, the Arab-Israel conflict, the U.S.-Israeli relations. He's currently writing a book on Israeli grand strategy and its domestic origins. He's taught on the conflict at Georgetown University's Department of Government and has done research in their security studies program. NATAN has been a Fulbright Fellow in Indonesia. I think you guys get the impression. So with that, I would like to welcome our panel to the stage. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. First, thank you to Susie and to David Halperin and to Michael Koplow and the whole team at IPF for the pleasure of being with close friends, and a real honor to be here at the Peter Forum and to honor your leadership in these affairs, and all close friends of the Brookings Institution, and if I may, people I look up to as well. So thank you for that. You probably heard at least the first 3 biographies, and you can see what a task it is to try and shepherd this kind of conversation. We have a lot to cover with history. So this is purely historical. So if anyone reads anything into this, if we're talking about leadership or about ethics, and you're thinking about modern times, that's on you. A journalist in the crowd asked me to create news. So no one will mention Bibi Netanyahu today. No one will mention Donald Trump. I hear the National Security Advisor is something we might be discussing. We will not discuss that. But more seriously, when we think about the leadership, we're thinking about 3 historic giants in Israel history, very different perspectives, very different personalities. And of course, they say a lot about leadership, about current leadership. Netanyahu as well, one of the main figures in Israeli history, and future prime ministers, whenever there is the next prime minister as well. Trying to figure out what that means. That may be soon, maybe later. I'll leave that for the panelists to say. We will have questions in the end, and since I'm not in Washington right now, I'm going to try to make it not about me and actually have it as short as possible. It won't be easy with 3 leaders. Here in real America, of course, not DC, out in the field. So the task here is formidable. And as I said, we have 3 very different figures. If you're thinking of David Ben-Gurion, just the man, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, it's really hard to imagine 3 more different personalities in Israeli history. And 3 different leaders with very different perspectives on what the state might be and what their role is in it. Just for an example, if you think of their role in the country, David Ben-Gurion was the establishment. Sometimes people even use his name to speak of the early establishment. Menachem Begin was the outsider. Ben-Gurion referred to him as the man sitting next to a member of Knesset Badr. He didn't even want to call him by his name for quite a few years. Yitzhak Rabin was an insider-outsider. He was a member of the Palmach, so not really in Ben-Gurion's camp, perhaps, but then also senior leader of Tzal, of the IDF. So if I may start, and maybe I'll start with the one prime minister I remember best, which is Rabin. I remember Begin too. It's the first prime minister I remember. But maybe I'll start with the one I remember best, and especially since we are at an IPF event. Ambassador RABINOVICH, ITAMAR, if you could tell us a bit about Rabin the man. You knew him quite well. Just how did that person, so shy, so reserved, how did he become a towering figure, a prime minister twice?
So, shy, reserved, introverted, He had he did not have charisma. He had authority. Authority was based on the fact that he was smart. He understood military affairs, that he excelled in them, became Mr. National Security in the 1980s, and his career developed gradually. Unlike charismatic leaders like Moshe Dayan, who at the age of 20, people looked at him and said he's going to go places, Rabin was not there. And Rabin, as Rabin moved on through his military career, then diplomatic, then political career, he always looked at the next step, not at the end of the journey. And after being Chief of Staff, the victorious Chief of Staff in 1967, Prime Minister Eshkol asked him, what would you like to do now? And he said, I'd like to be ambassador in Washington. He wanted to go into politics. He felt that he was too parochial, and he needed to be exposed to the greater world, and he thought that the stint in Washington would do it, which it did. And then he wanted to be a cabinet member, not so easy between him and Golda. He came back in 1973, did not have a position during the October War, and when Golda had to resign in 1974 due to the debacle at the outset of the war, he was the perfect candidate for labor. Former Chief of Staff, very successful ambassador in Washington, not tarnished, his reputation not tarnished by the war. And he had the support of the party brass, and he defeated Shimon Peres in the primaries and became prime minister. Not ready for the job. Rabin was prime minister twice, 74 to 77, 92 to 95. It's the second term that defined him as a great statesman. The first term was what I call a policy success and political failure. It ended with a resignation. The policy success was the interim agreement with Egypt that laid the basis for the peace with Egypt and taking Israel out of the crisis of 1973, reconstructing the economy and the IDF. So, and of course I should say, for somebody who ended up being a very effective prime minister, a very hesitant politician, a very reluctant politician. Didn't like small talk, didn't like pressing the flesh, didn't like picking up the phone to the party members in this or that branch, everything that Shimon Peres, his great rival, excelled at. To those of you who have seen or will see the movie Entebbe, you will see a recent manifestation of that rivalry. So an awkward politician and a great statesman.
Thank you. ANITA, Ben Gurion seems to be, in a sense, the opposite. Maybe it's just nostalgia speaking, but you say Ben Gurion, you say great leader. Was this obvious? Was David Green from Plonsk obviously that?
You said that Ben Gurion was the ultimate establishment. Well, it took him many years to become the establishment. He was not thought to be the leading man, I would say, until the early 30s, when he was already in his 50s. So it took him a very long trial to get where he was. And this trial was also the process through which he matured. He had a very tempestuous character. He was a revolutionary by nature. And reality always frustrated him because reality never matched his imagination. And this frustration erupted sometimes in storms that his friends and politicians around him had to curb him, had to make him face reality, to face the fact that not everything that he wanted, he had the tools to achieve. But the result was that because he became a national leader only in the 40s, his trajectory helped him to understand politics to the very, very delicate nuances. And he became a leader with charisma only after he became prime minister, after the establishment of the state. Naturally, he did not have charisma, but then in the last years of his life, I would say since 48, he was exceptionally charismatic. People thought that he was the father of all of us. When he resigned the first time in 52 to go to Sde-Boker, why did he do it? He did it because he thought that he has to reignite the fire of pioneering. So if he goes to Sde-Boker, the youth of the country would follow him. But this did not happen. And in his last years, he was very frustrated with the state he established. The state did not live up to his ideals. Now, he had a wonderful quality, which I think exceptional. He cared about culture. In his days, the most difficult years economically of the state of Israel, 4 universities were established. And there was never a case that funds were not found for culture. He established the Academy of Science. He established the Prize of Israel. And all of that he did in times when the economy was in dire straits. I'm not mentioning all his political achievements, establishment of the state, the War of Independence, winning the War of Independence, leading the creation of the state institutions, the reparation agreement, etc., etc., etc. Nevertheless, he was very much frustrated because the state did not become the ideal state that he had in mind. The utopian image of a light to the nations did not realize, and he knew it. And this frustrated him in his last years terribly. And as usual, he had no patience. His character was a very lively personality. Rabin, for instance, was the opposite. He loved, by the way, the argument. He loved the debate. He would like very much to cross swords at the Knesset. This was his forte. And he did it especially interestingly. But I think I talked too much.
Thank you, but fascinating. And I neglected to say, all these are teasers. The real meat of it is in the books. So here are 3 things that lead sort of directly to Begin, either directly or the opposite. An arc, a very long arc to leadership. Begin lost many elections, was in the political desert, was the man sitting next to Badel. He was, but unlike these 2 leaders, was a naturally charismatic orator, a brilliant speaker. In the election campaigns of the 70s and the 80s, I remember there was fiery speaking. And he certainly loved the debate in the Knesset. What was Begin like compared to these two? Is it fair to say he's almost the opposite of the two, if you could be the opposite of two things?
Well, I think he's also, in a lot of ways, despite the charisma, a rather private person in his own way. He had these years in the middle, just like the others were talking about. There was a kind of an arc. When he finally hit his stride as prime minister in '77, he really became a fiery orator, and which he already was before. The reparations we saw already in Kikar Tzion, and he gave his very famous speech. But when I think of Begin, we all think of him as the guy that made the Egyptian deal, the guy that won the 9th election after losing 8 in a row, which apparently is some sort of history-making achievement in the Western world. Apparently, that's what they say. I haven't checked every country, every candidate, but that's what I'm told. He bombed Iraq. He was the prime minister during Sabra and Shatila. He got Israel involved in Lebanon. So you think of him during those relatively few years as a guy of tremendous accomplishment, both good and some people would say bad. But as you pointed out, there's a very long, dark, painful period of 29 years. And when I think of Begin's personality, what strikes me more than anything else is that he begins and ends his career in Eretz Israel hiding. He hides at the beginning from the British for a very long time, and then he hides from Am Yisrael at the end of his life after Eliza dies, and he resigns. Interestingly enough, by the way, we're not going to compare to anything modern at all, but just to say, I'm just saying, when he resigned the premiership, he actually had nowhere to go live. He didn't have any money. He'd won the Nobel Prize. He'd given all the money away. He and Eliza had lived in a rented apartment on Rosenbaum 1 in Tel Aviv. So when he left the premiership, he moved in with his daughter. There were complicated other reasons for that as well, but this is a very different kind of guy. But he begins in hiding, and he ends in hiding. And I think that actually says a tremendous amount about both the greatness of his ability to come out in the middle, but also the tragic nature of his life as well. There's a very kind of a tragic figure in here as well, despite tremendous accomplishment. The only other thing that I would add, and I think it's interesting to think that, I don't know if we'll get to it tonight, but it would be an interesting lens through which to look at these three characters, is to ask, from where comes their devotion to the idea of a Jewish state? Because they're actually all very different wellsprings. In other words, Begin was not, everybody thinks he was religious. He wasn't religious. But he had a kind of a love and affinity for Jewish tradition, which the others, Ben-Gurion grew up with it and abandoned it, and Rabin never had it. But Rabin obviously is the first Sabra to become prime minister, and Ben-Gurion is a person who, like very many of the elder statesmen of the Zionist movement, most of whom ANITA's written books about, grew up in these traditional homes. Peres was an example of that, and many others, and then left it. So it would be an interesting conversation to ask what got each of these three people, each of them in their own way, to be so passionately devoted to this idea of a Jewish state. I think they came to it from very different places.
In Meridor's words, he spoke Jewish. Begin
right, he spoke Jewish. That's what turned him on, by the way. And American Jews, when he was elected in 1977, were horrified. Right, first of all, when he became the head of the opposition as the head of Cherut at the beginning in 1948, 49, he comes to the States, and there are literally occasions, like in Cleveland, where nobody shows up to hear him. The establishment had orchestrated it so that nobody would show. There would be 2 people, 3 people, but the auditorium would be empty. So he was really the paradigmatic outsider of that, and when he becomes prime minister in 1977, of course, people are panicked, right? A terrorist, he blew up the King David Hotel, he was the head of the Etzel, he's kind of this old Polish gentleman trying to run a modern Israeli Sabra country. Nothing fit about him, and of course, he did tremendous things. He did, obviously, Egypt. He did Iraq, which is much in the news today because in light of the revealing of the story about Damascus in 2007, there's now been a lot of discussion of what's called the Begin Doctrine. I think that there's a tremendous amount of passion there. There's a tremendous amount of accomplishment, but also a tremendous amount of sadness.
Thank you. These three figures meet, of course, throughout their many years, and many of these points that you can see in the 3 different books actually define, I think, a lot of Israeli history. I'd be remiss if we don't mention the obvious early one, which is Altalena. So Yitzhak Rabin was visiting his girlfriend at the time, Leah, and happened to be around at the headquarters and found himself the senior officer. Itamar, could you walk us through what's happening there and why this is such a momentous moment for Israel?
Yes, I will, but before I do that, I'd like to mention the fact that our three hero persona interact. They all affect each other. It's been mentioned how Ben Gurion ostracized Begin. Rabin and Ben Gurion had a lengthy relationship. Rabin was a young officer. Ben Gurion knew his mother, and actually Rabin stood up to Ben Gurion as a young man and went to the demonstration against the disbanding of the Palmach. And the most dramatic moment is on the eve of the Six-Day War, when Rabin, perplexed, goes to see Ben Gurion, and Ben Gurion gives him a piece of his mind and admonishes him, and Rabin has a 2 days breakdown after that. And Rabin, I was both ambassador and peace negotiator with him. He always looked at Begin as an example of the man who made this huge decision about peace with Egypt, who had the courage to go against his own grain and knew how to sell it to the Israeli public. And he tried to, when we negotiated with Syria, he tried to tailor-make the deal with Syria to look like the deal with Egypt, because that has already been legitimized by Begin. So now, Altalena is an amazing story. Altalena, to those of you who do not know, was a ship brought by Menachem Begin's Irgun.
But without his knowledge.
By the French branch of the Irgun, came to what has now become the state of Israel. And Ben Gurion was very steadfast. It carried some immigrants and it carried weapons given by the French government to the Irgun. And Ben Gurion was very steadfast. He said, if Israel is to survive, it needs to have one authority, one army. And therefore, he refused to allow the Irgun to take the weapons to Jerusalem. That was not part of the state. And later on, he disbanded the Palmach, which was sort of a militia of the left.
No, it's at that time, excuse me.
Yeah.
At that time, the Palmach was a part of the IDF already.
Later.
And not a militia. And on the other hand, you have to remember how young the state was. The state was about 2 weeks old, something like that. And the question of the sovereignty of the state and of authority was for Ben Gurion a major question. He was always suspicious of the anarchistic inclinations of the Jewish people. Jews did not accept authority.
He was also very suspicious of Begin as a person.
Yes, but nevertheless, this was not the major question. He wanted to have a saying loud and clear. Now is a new era. There is one authority, one army, that's it. Sometimes, I must say today, I feel that this kind of approach could have helped us sometimes.
Yeah. So, Ben Gurion used a Hebrew term that is not exactly translatable into English, mamlachtiyut, sort of statism. The state had to have this authority, and therefore he wanted the Irgun to submit, and eventually when they did not submit, he ordered the artillery to fire at the boat, and it sank, and this of course became a big issue then and subsequently. Now, as it happened, Yitzhak Rabin, this was the first ceasefire in the War of Independence. Rabin, a lieutenant colonel, was visiting his girlfriend, subsequent wife, or future wife, Leah, in the Palmach headquarters on the Tel Aviv beach when the fighting with Altalena began, and a couple of smaller boats came from the boat to the coast, and there was fighting, and Rabin was the most senior officer on the scene, and he took charge, and there was some fighting, but the two major elements of the Altalena affair, the sinking of the Altalena And later, the offensive against the Irgun people in the Tel Aviv region were conducted by Ben Gurion and by Yigal Alon, who is the subject of another biography by ANITA. So Rabin had basically played a very marginal role in the Altalena affair. And if you open the first book on Altalena, written by Begin's spokesman and a very much a Likud, Cherut person called Shlomo Nagdimon, the story of Altalena, you barely read 2 lines about Rabin. Later on, when Rabin became prime minister and began to clash with the settlers and with the right wing, they dug up the Altalena affair, and as the assassin, Yigal Amir, said, someone who killed Jews on the beach in Tel Aviv deserved to be assassinated. And this now became a big cause célèbre when today the right wing turned Rabin into the major culprit in the Altalena affair. So much so that there is a website in the Prime Minister's office that commemorates former Israeli presidents and prime ministers who passed away. Somebody broke into that website and inserted an ugly segment into it in order to blacken Rabin's name. So,
and Daniel, it's not just the Yigal Amir who was traumatized by this. You still can hear among huge parts of the population in Israel the memory of Altalena, the memory of the saison, the French season of hunting against the Irgun, the right wing. This was a huge deal for Begin. Begin couldn't swim. He was on the boat and couldn't swim, right?
So
I don't agree.
Well, we'll come back to that.
That's why we're here.
First of all, this does leave everybody very traumatized. And I'll just start by telling you one quick story. I have a 95, 96-year-old cousin in Afula. And whenever we're up in the north, for my wife, anything within 300 miles is right around the corner from Afula. We have to go visit the cousin. So we were coming down from the Golan one time about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. And she says, we'll go to Afula, we'll say hi to so-and-so. And we didn't have anything to bring. And my wife was much better bred than I was. I thought, who cares? She's 95, what does he need? But in any event, she thought we had to bring something. So we went to the store, we bought a copy of my Begin biography. I bring him a copy of the Begin biography. And he says to me very suspiciously, he was in the Haganah, I should mention. He says to me very suspiciously, did you know Begin? As if you didn't know him, you actually can't write a book about him. So I pointed out people write books about Genghis Khan. I don't think most of them knew him. So he accepted that point. But then to sort of get over it, I said to him, did you know Begin? And he said, well, no, but I fired at him because he was part of the thing on the ground. Look, the Altalena leaves very great scars, but it also emerges from very great divisions. In other words, President Rabinovich is absolutely, of course, correct that this has a lot to do with solidifying and unifying the various military operations under the IDF. It also has to do, though, from Begin's point of view, with trying to save his soldiers who are defending Jerusalem, which is therefore at that point not part of Israel, to which Ben Gurion, perhaps quite legitimately, does not want to send IDF resources to defend a city that is not going to be part of the country. To Begin, the position was, these guys are dying, we've got to get them some arms. So what was portrayed, I think, unfairly, but we can argue about that, by Ben Gurion as being a kind of a resistance against the authority of the state, I think from Begin's perspective, and he certainly didn't necessarily handle it right, from his perspective was a matter of, we have all these arms in the boat, let's take some small percentage and try to save some of these guys in Jerusalem. The Altalena also becomes something that actually symbolizes great divisions between the leftists, laborites, and then the generations that come from the people in the Etzel and eventually Likud down the road. People who were in the Etzel after 48, 49 couldn't get jobs in government offices. People who were killed in the fighting after there was fighting actually on the ground, and soldiers were killed, and Etzel people were killed. Not many, thank God, but a few were. Ben Gurion did not allow them to be buried in cemeteries in Tel Aviv. So what we're talking about here is a very deep divide in the country. The explosion of the boat is really just a kind of a very pinnacle of a very deep divide about a whole array of issues. If you want to make things even a little bit more interesting and complex, and the way biography influences ideology and so forth, the person who was responsible for buying the Altalena in America, the money raising and all of that, is Jeremy Ben-Ami's father, who after
He's the founder of J Street,
who after the Altalena is sunk, leaves Israel and never goes back. So there's a tremendous number of people here who feel violated, who feel betrayed, who feel that their position was the noble position. And the truth of the matter is that they were all, on some level, right. Ben-Gurion was right that they had to unify the armed forces. Begin was right that the guys in Jerusalem needed to be defended. As one last sentence about this, I think one of the ways of looking at Israeli history is to point out that very often the people who are on the opposite sides of the divide, if we didn't have both, we wouldn't have anything. If you didn't have Herzl and Achad Ha'am, you'd have no Jewish state of any substance, because without Herzl there'd be no state, without Achad Ha'am there'd be no substance to it. If you didn't have Begin and Ben-Gurion, you'd have no Jewish state. Ben-Gurion built the whole infrastructure and got the state ready, and I think a lot of people I would certainly suggest that if it was not for Begin's willingness to ultimately bomb the King David Hotel, among other things, the British weren't going anywhere so fast. But anyway, I think it's very often ways to look at, you need both, not one or the other.
So, Anita, I want to turn to you, but 1 second. I just want to point out that,
This is very
I just
hard
want
for
to point
let her
out
go.
that the debates of the 1940s have died down, and they're long in the past,
I
and
am
no one
not
cares.
going, I am not going to talk about it.
No,
again.
I want to ask,
No,
Hebrews comes out.
I just want to say that I think that today the issue of Altalena, the issue of the Saison are, as my mother would say, kaltel auction, which means something that is of no meaning today. It is only of meaning to old people, older than me even. So I don't see how it affects today the Likud, the Labour Party. It is non-issues anymore.
I think it's clear.
The current government is trying to reshape the Israeli narrative, and they do it in a very blatant way, including they put in some very aggressive speakers on different talk shows on the radio. And if you listen to any of these talk shows, never mind the talkbacks, they revive all these issues as they enumerate the sins of the labor movement. So if ANITA simply writes in the morning, and I sometimes listen to the radio, and I hear some of that rhetoric, and there's a deliberate attempt to rewrite the history.
I think this is important. I'm going to have to move to another issue on a tasting menu. But I do want to point out that this question of the insider-outsider and who sees themselves as the establishment, who is the outsider, has first changed dramatically in Israel. And secondly, I think is politically extremely important, Daniel, as actually all of you have pointed out. I want to jump to a completely different topic. A minor issue, the question of relations between Jews and Arabs in the land. And especially what's known as the demographic questions. Susie, when she introduced the evening, said that the IPF is dedicated to preserving Israel as Jewish, democratic, etc. And the core of the dilemma, the trilemma really she posed, was about how to have the land, but also the Jewish nature and also a democracy. Back in the early Knesset, Ben-Gurion was explaining, he was asked why in 1949, when the war had already turned in favor of what was already Israel, under his leadership, the West Bank was not taken. And he said, let's assume we could militarily conquer the whole western land of Israel. And he said, we could probably. Then what? We would create one state, but this state would want to be democratic. There will be general elections, and we will be in the minority. This is in the first Knesset, I believe. Fast forward to 1967. He meets Rabin, as ITAMAR described. He fears the worst. What was his reaction when the West Bank was taken, and the Gaza Strip, of course?
He continued to keep true to his opinion that was formed in the late 30s, that in order to solve the question of the land, we have to partition it. And Ben-Gurion remained an adherent of the partition idea since the 30s, straight on until he died. He said that in 1967 that we should give back all the West Bank and Gaza against, when we have a true peace with the Arabs, except for Jerusalem and Golan Heights. So Ben-Gurion always thought about the demographic question. And not only that, I would say that to the question of the land, there were, from the very beginning, two possible venues to solve it. One was the partition of the land, and the other was giving up part of sovereignty, namely sharing the ruling of the land with the Arabs. This remained true to this very day. Either you have a binational state, or you have to give up part of the land. I don't see anything changed from the early 30s.
I think one of the most interesting differences, perhaps, between both Rabin and Ben-Gurion and Begin is exactly on this question. Begin, just before he's elected to prime minister in France, he speaks in the parliament, actually, and he says about his own plan, "We shall give a free option of citizenship to the members of the Arab nation which we recognize. There will be one law for them and the Jewish citizens. If they choose to become citizens, they will vote to the Knesset as well. If they choose to be legal residents, rather, they will have rights except for voting." And they said the Arab minority shall have cultural autonomy. This continues when he's elected. He presents his plan to the Knesset. It evolves, however, into the autonomy. Could you explain a bit Begin's thinking? How did he wrestle with the numbers?
Yeah, not everybody's going to agree about the interpretation. My interpretation is, when I was writing the book, there were two people that I really wanted to try to understand. I asked about autonomy. What was he really thinking about autonomy? And I spoke to Dan Meridor, and I spoke to Yechiel Kadishai, who unfortunately has passed away since then. And they
it was
both
Begin's personal assistant.
He was his right-hand man in many ways. And they both said the same thing, that both in the 7th Knesset, I think it was in 1969 when he first made this comment about giving Arabs citizenship, and even later when he was talking about autonomy, he didn't really know what he was talking about. In other words, he was trying in 1969, I think, to make clear what certain people never were willing to acknowledge, was that the Begin-Jabotinsky line, which is most definitely not the Jabotinsky-Begin-Netanyahu line, it is just not. The name of the party may be the same thing, but there's just no overlap in terms of fundamental liberalism. He was trying to show that the Jabotinskyites were fundamentally liberals, by which we mean not left-wingers, but fundamentally committed to human rights, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. It's one of the things that got him elected, by the way, right? Because he didn't have the certain elitism of the Europeans vis-a-vis the Mizrahim, and the Mizrahim ultimately in 1977 voted him into power. But already in 1969 and so forth, he's saying to the world, whatever you think of me, understand this, I'm really fundamentally a liberal. What can I say that's going to make you understand that? I'm willing for Arabs to be able to be citizens. I don't know if he really thought it through. I think the same thing is true of autonomy. The same thing is true, by the way, with the people today who are talking about annexation, who have thought through absolutely none of it. Because, that was a very serious point. Because if you annex just Area C, for example, or parts of Area C, I know we're sort of getting into the modern stuff, but you end up taking in, for example, at least several, just in Area C, several 100,000 Palestinians who all of a sudden get health care, get education, have rights. This is an extremely expensive operation, having nothing to do with democracy, Judaism, and so on and so forth. So I actually don't think that Begin was serious about it either time. I don't think he was meaning to be duplicitous. I think the first time he was trying to show that he's really liberal at heart, and the second time with autonomy, it's really trying to avoid Carter's pressuring to move in the direction of making some accommodation to the Palestinians, which he was never going to do. One last point about this. When I interviewed Kadishai, it was during the building freeze that Obama had imposed on Netanyahu at that point. And Kadishai, to his dying day, was a defender of Begin. Begin was, the great whatever. And I was sitting in his living room, in his apartment in Tel Aviv, and I said to him, let's say Begin was prime minister today, and Obama said to him, you got to do a building freeze in the West Bank. What would Begin say? And I was ready for him to say, he would tell that president, blah, blah, blah. And he said, he took a deep breath, and he said, להגיד לך את האמת, אין לי מושג. To tell you the truth, I have no idea. And that's Begin's greatness. In other words, the same guy that was perceived as the ultra hawk gave away the Sinai to try to make peace. The same guy, for example, who got the Nobel Prize, was also the guy who attacked Osirak. In other words, he was a complicated guy, and I think part of his greatness was that we have no way of knowing what he would do today. It's very easy to say either he gave back land, so he'd give back land. His objection wasn't to giving back land, it was to creating another state that he thought would be an enemy of the Jewish people or the Jewish state. By the same token, some people say, why did he go into a deep depression at the end? Because he understood that by giving Sinai, he'd created a precedent giving back the West Bank. I think that's ridiculous. But all of these men are very complicated, very nuanced, very multifaceted, and we have no way of knowing, for example, just because of his stand about autonomy or citizenship back then, what he would say about the demographics today. He was ultimately a pragmatist.
So, Itamar, I'd like to turn to you and ask you to commit the cardinal sin for an historian, which is to ask the counterfactual. Following exactly on this, what would happen, what would Rabin's position be had he lived, if only? Would he have really gone in his second term, assuming he had won an election, which is an assumption, would he have gone for something like the Clinton parameters, Jordan Valley, Palestinian state, Jerusalem?
If I may, just two brief comments about Begin and autonomy. First, Sadat began by asking something much simpler. He wanted a sentence. Israel recognizes the legitimate national rights of the Palestinians. And Begin, who was educated in a Polish law school and thought about abstract ideas and so forth, said, I can do that because legitimate national rights means statehood, and I will not do that. So he went in a circuitous way to look for something else, and that something else was also rooted in his earlier experience in life, in the autonomy ideas in Eastern and Central Europe, where he grew up. Anyway, about Rabin. So Rabin's last statement on the issue was made in October 1995 during the Knesset vote on the Oslo II, a few weeks before the assassination, and he said a Palestinian entity less than a state. That was his last formal stated position. Now, of course, he knew that final status negotiations lay ahead, and he knew that there would be a very tough bargaining and negotiation with Arafat, and of course, why would he say statehood and give Arafat the bottom line before the negotiations started? I think that, Rabin was a smart man. When he signed the Oslo Accord, he knew very well that the end of the road was statehood. Now, on Jerusalem, he had a very fierce position. He fought in Jerusalem and on the way to Jerusalem in 1948. This was a traumatic experience for him, and it would have been very difficult for him. It would have been easier in other places. Now, as we speculate this counterfactual history, you have to remember that he had yet to be re-elected. He was not leading in the polls against Netanyahu at the time. And then he would have to negotiate with Arafat, which would not have been that easy. I think that if he were living today and had to deal with today, he would try to go for unilateral or for a program not dissimilar to the one that this forum is very well familiar with, of the Commanders for Israeli Security. So not full statehood, definitely not annexation, definitely not creeping annexation, which is the so-called status quo, because there is no status quo. So I would say less than a state in the given circumstances, but definitely not the status quo.
Thank you. I want to leave enough time for questions, and we will have 2 microphones, and we'll ask people to line up by them. I'll give a final sort of lightning round question before we begin, and I'd like to recognize Congresswoman. Thank you for joining us. If I may ask now to break all our rules and think about today, because we have journalists in the audience and they want that. What can we learn from these 3 figures, from this question of leadership, all the ups and downs, the arcs, etc., about the state of Israel? All of you actually hinted at it. But if you can, briefly, and before we turn to the audience, what's the takeaway, do you think, from these 3 leaders?
May I go to the question, when a leader should retire. No. I'm talking
Which
about
country are you talking
history.
about?
I'm talking about history. Now, the question, this is a very complicated question, because if we look at the careers of both Churchill and de Gaulle, they had their moment in history, and then they ended ignobly. Now, let's go to our leaders. Rabin, in a way, was lucky, excuse me for saying that, because what happened to him was what happened to Herzl. He died before his time. And as a result, he remained beautiful in our memory. Now, Ben-Gurion stayed on too long. I just think about, had he not returned from Sde Boker in 1953, when he went the first time to Sde Boker, he got thousands and thousands of letters from citizens worried about his return. But he returned. Then he could have retired after the Sinai campaign, but he did not. He could have retired in 1959 after his greatest election victory. He did not. He could have retired in 1960 after he announced in the Knesset the capture of Eichmann. But he did not. He stayed on and retired in 1963, vilified by almost everybody and getting on the nerves of everybody. And then we have Begin, the same story. Had he retired after the first term, he would have been the greatest leader ever. The second term ended very, very poorly with his hiding from the people of Israel. So the question of when a leader should retire, and coming back to the basic question, is a very, very question that has meaning to our time as well. And I myself, I wish Prime Minister Netanyahu that he would know when to retire.
Thank you. Daniel.
One of the things, well, we found the subject of that, which was unanimity. That's good. One of the things that I think it's important to understand these people was the sense of tremendous responsibility that they had for safeguarding the future of the Jewish people. In other words, they were not politicians as much as they were on a mission from history, a mission from God, a mission from whatever. These were people, all three of them in their own way, very much on a mission. And I don't want to be misunderstood in any way in saying the following thing, but Netanyahu sees himself the same way. I agree with you, he should retire like last year. But Netanyahu has convinced himself that he is Israel's savior. He believes when he gets into bed at the end of the day that there is nobody else in the state who can negotiate with Trump and with India and with China and keep Israel safe in the skies over Syria. He just really believes that. By the way, so do a lot of Israelis, which is why you have most Israelis being relatively sure that at least in two of the tikim, accusations, that cases, that he's probably very guilty, and being willing to sort of give it a pass because they actually have bought into this savior thing to a certain extent. Now, obviously, most of us here look at this particular example in a not particularly positive way. But I think, again, when I look at somebody like Ben-Gurion, yeah, he should have retired here, should have retired. But if he had been a man who could have retired, he would not have been the man who would have built the state. That's just the nature of the complexity of the personalities.
Thank you. Itamar, any final comments? And especially I want to note that Rabin, he had a disastrous or terrible end, but he also resigned from her first term under very specific circumstances. So,
yeah. So two points. One actually is to do with Begin and Netanyahu. Danny mentioned now that a lot of Israelis see Netanyahu as the savior too. Many of them are Mizrahi Israelis. And the man who created the alliance between the Likud and the Mizrahi component of the Israeli population was Begin.
No, it was Ben Gurion who turned them away.
Okay.
No, it was.
And Begin was there to
But
collect.
they loved Ben Gurion.
Yeah.
They didn't vote for him. They loved him, but they didn't vote for
They
him.
voted for him as
Historians.
long as he stayed
Anyway.
in office.
Anyway, Begin was there to collect. You remember the famous speech where he spoke about the kibbutz member sitting by the pool and the people in the development town and so. And so he was able to formulate and sell, quote unquote, the doctrine is that there is this natural alliance between you, the underprivileged, and us. We are also isolated, persecuted, underprivileged. We are in power, but we are not the establishment. The establishment is the old Ashkenazi labor, academic, intellectual establishment. And that is very valid to this very day. You cannot understand current Israeli politics without it. Now, you asked about the component of leadership. I think it's the ability to make those historic decisions that, in a way, even run against your grain. You realize that it's either an opportunity or a must. It needs to be done. It's very difficult, and you have it in you to do two things. One is to make the decision and then to make the country or the people follow you and implement. And all three share in that.
thank you very much. Why don't we open up to questions? And we have the mics, as I said, so people, I think, will line up. I think that's what we're doing. Should we take one or two questions at a time, perhaps? We'll take two. I ask that they be questions, so please have a question mark at the end and brief if possible. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation and kind of funny. I note that we're at Israel Policy Forum, which many people have described as if Prime Minister Rabin and President Clinton had had a baby, this would be it. So it begs the question, the importance of Bill Clinton's relationship with Yitzhak Rabin and the importance of the United States being the first to recognize the state of Israel under Ben Gurion and the relationship between Begin and Carter that enabled the Camp David Accords. Can you speak a little bit to where each one of these leaders felt their relationship with the United States impacted how they governed and how they were able to make important decisions in connection with those important decisions?
Thank you. Excellent question. Let's hold that for a minute and take one or two more. Please, ma'am.
The three leaders that you spoke about were largely secular, but there is kind of this growing both demographic bloc and political bloc in Israel that is very religious, sometimes even ultra-Orthodox. I would love for you to address what that means for future leaders in Israel, as well as if we've seen anything like this in the past.
Thank you. And we'll take one last question here on this side.
Ambassador Rabinovich, Begin gets all the credit for the peace with Egypt. Would you comment on Rabin's role, and would it have occurred if Rabin had not established the four underpinnings of the situation?
Great. So we have the U.S. relationship, the question of the religious bloc of various kinds, and the question of the interim agreements, the Kissinger agreements in the 70s. Why don't we start on this?
Okay. Actually, Ben Gurion, from the very first time, from before the establishment of the state, from the early 1940s, thought that the United States and Soviet Russia are going to win the Second World War and replace the old empires of France and Egypt and France and England in the Middle East. And as a result of that, from the very beginning, Ben-Gurion sought the friendship of the United States. And he did it consciously. He tried to accommodate America. He moved Israel from a neutrality between the two major powers to a pro-Western course. But the United States in the 50s did not favor Israel. And the role that it had during the Sinai campaign was a deplorable one. So the time of Ben-Gurion was a slow melt of the frosty relationship in the 50s, a better one with Kennedy, but also there was confrontation around the creation of the Dimona project. So I cannot say that Ben-Gurion succeeded in his personal relations with the White House. He was never invited to the White House.
I think it's a very important point to recognize. We often talk about, we're in a crisis now that's unprecedented. There's a rift between American Jews and Israel that's unprecedented. It's actually not true. It was also true in the 50s, where there was a bubble between 67, let's say, and 82 with Sabra and Shatila. There was a bubble of 15 years when things were very good, but it was very bad before. It's very bad now. And the same thing is true with the presidents. For Begin, well, Begin thought that Carter was simply an unabashed anti-Semite. And he may have very well been right. But he had no patience for Carter, and Carter thought Begin was a lunatic. He called him a psychopath, literally. He used that word. So they actually despised each other. And Camp David, of course, almost broke up. He almost left. But the relationships between Begin and Carter were terrible. In fact, when Begin ultimately went into seclusion after his resignation, Carter, I forget the circumstances, but ended up being in Israel and asked to see Begin, and Begin wouldn't see him. So that tells you something. The relationship with Reagan also, though, was also not a love affair. Reagan was pretty furious about Osirak at the beginning. He made it very clear that he thought Israel had no right to do it. Of course, subsequently, he changed his tune. Subsequently, American generals came out and thanked Israel for doing it, because when they went into Iraq, if they had to go into Iraq.
The bombing of the Iraqi nuclear reactor.
Iraq in the first week in June in 1981. The reason I know that is because we went on our honeymoon and we came back to our hotel and saw a newspaper that said Israel bombs nuclear reactor in Iraq. I thought, yeah, right, and a monkey marries Martian. What is this, the National Enquirer? And then it turns out, so I tell my wife, I always know when we got married because I know when Begin bombed but in any of it actually works the other way. So again, even in, we'll hear about Rabin in a second, but the relationship of the two presidents that Begin worked with was a very, very frosty relationship.
Thank you. Itamar, several questions.
So Rabin loved America to begin with. It had to do with the fact that his father, Nehemiah, by the way, the original name, you would have thought was Rabinovich, but actually it was Rubichek. Nehemiah Rubichek went from Ukraine to St. Louis and then came in 1917 to Palestine. And he told his son many stories about how great America was, certainly compared to Tsarist Russia. And then Rabin, as ambassador in Washington, had the time of his life. He developed a taste for the American way of life, quote unquote, came very far away from the socialist values of his parents. In the 50s, one of the sources of his rivalry with Shimon Peres was that Shimon Peres had a European orientation, French, German, and Rabin always wanted America to get weapon systems from America, which eventually became feasible. And he always made sure that his relationship with the United States, or with the policymakers, as Minister of Defense and then as Prime Minister, first time and second time would be close. And one very important element, which was very typical of Rabin. Rabin was a straightforward man, always said what he thought, no double games. And this is what American presidents appreciate in general. An American president doesn't like to hear no from an Israeli prime minister, but at least he knows where he stands. With Rabin, they knew. I mean, I had the privilege of sitting on many meetings between Rabin and Clinton and see the love affair develop. And one of the things that Clinton appreciated was the fact that Rabin would always tell him the truth as it was. If I may take 1 minute, it's unrelated to the question, but I think the audience deserves a piece of folklore. A story that my wife, Efrat, who sits here, and I heard from Shimon Peres, who went with Ben Gurion to visit de Gaulle in 1960. The famous photograph of the tall de Gaulle and the short Ben Gurion standing next to one another is from that meeting. And de Gaulle gave Ben Gurion a lunch. And at the table were de Gaulle, Ben Gurion, Peres, and the French Prime Minister Michel Debré. And, you know, both of them were not great in small talk, so de Gaulle begins and said, "Mr. Prime Minister, what do you want most for your country?" And Ben Gurion said, "More Jews." Yes. And de Gaulle says, "What?" And he says, "More Jews." De Gaulle calls the foreign minister, he said, he wants more Jews. And then he says to Ben Gurion, "Where will you bring these Jews from?" He said, "French Jews are not going to go to Israel. American Jews are not going to go to Israel. And the Soviet Union will not allow the Jews to go to Israel." And Ben Gurion looked at him and said, "In 30 years, the Soviet Union will collapse and the Jews from Russia will come to Israel." He was wrong by 1 year.
Thank you. Is it fair to say that you agree that the 70s, the interim agreements are crucial for the peace treaty?
Oh, yeah. This was the building block for the subsequent peace treaty, and there would have been no peace in 79 or 77, Camp David, without the interim agreement of 1975.
And why don't we take a few more questions? I'm conscious that we're missing one.
Want to go to the religious issue? The religious issue was asked before. That's obviously a major transformation in Israeli life. We owe it to a certain extent to Ben Gurion, who I think in one of the mistakes that he made was the mistake of giving 400 people earlier on the exemption from the army for going to yeshiva study.
But he gave it to 400.
I understand. And he gave it to 400.
It was Begin who dismissed the ceiling.
Okay, that's also true. But the idea, no, that's true. That's true. But the point is, there was really at any point, most people who wanted it got it. Then the numbers just grew. And the precedent, again, I'm not blaming your guy. I'm trying to protect my guy. I'm just saying that the history of accommodating the Haredim goes back very early on. Just they were very, very small piece. Everybody misread them. Yes. Nathan Glazer, when he wrote A History of American Judaism, when he did not include the Orthodox in his prognostications about American Judaism in the 1950s, and when he wrote the introduction to the second edition of his book, he was asked, "Well, why did I not mention that?" Because it's over, guys. It's just over. That was apparently incorrect. And the same thing is true. Ben Gurion thought that the Haredim were a kind of holdover of survivors of the Second World War. There was no point picking a fight with a few hundred or a few thousand survivors of the war. Not picking a fight with them is, to be sure, correct, but holding them to a certain standard probably would have made it different. Look, it's an enormous issue that Israel faces, and there's no easy solution at this point. Some people say the horse is out of the barn, the train's out of the station, whatever you want to say. That demographically and economically it may not be fixable. Who knows? What I will just say to bring us back to the present for a second is that in addition to all of the various investigations, and in addition to all of whatever you think about he has or hasn't done about the peace process or whatever, to my mind, what's the greatest failure of the current administration in Israel? The greatest, and it's in another year or two, he'll be the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. You actually know nothing about what he thinks about how to fix that problem. you actually know nothing about what he thinks about a whole array of other issues. In other words, you actually have no idea. Menachem Begin and David Ben Gurion left voluminous writings, diaries and articles and books. You could actually figure out from David Ben Gurion's writings what he would say about a lot of things today, and you could do it with Begin as well, hundreds of articles and so on and so forth. I'm not blaming Netanyahu for not being a writer. That's not the issue at all. What I'm saying is that in being the second longest serving prime minister in Israel, for the vast majority of Israelis to have no idea what your vision for the Jewish state is a colossal failure.
Thank you.
It's a colossal failure.
So another failure is mine and the time. So we're going to take a question here from Susie.
First of all, thank you to all three of you, because this has been really illuminating. But we've been focusing on three great leaders from the past. I want to take us to the present and maybe to the future. I love what Risa said about Israel Policy Forum. If Bill Clinton and Yitzhak Rabin had a baby, it would be Israel Policy Forum.
Terrible optic, but okay.
Okay, yeah, and well, yes and no, depending on your perspective. But here's the point of my question, which is leadership is what matters. And the three of you have spent not a small part of your careers, and certainly your writing, focused on leadership. Where are we now, both in terms of Israel and the United States, in terms of leadership? Because clearly for Israel Policy Forum, we're focused on the present and the immediate future, as Israel is legitimately as well. So where do you see us going in terms of leaders who have vision and the capability of making that vision a reality? Because without it, I don't know where we are. So I just want to ask that question about where we are now and going forward.
So I think, look, it's a very important question, and I'm glad that you phrased it the way that you did, because this is not exclusively an Israeli question. There's 360 million Americans, and it's very hard to look at the landscape and say, oh, that's the person, the man or the woman that I would want to then next run the country. So with 8 million, it's just easier to understand why it's not obvious. I want to say two things about it. First of all, this notion of the savior is wrong. There are many other people in the country who can run the country, and they don't necessarily have the same amount of experience. But I would remind everybody that doubts that Levi Eshkol was hardly an inspiring person to be in charge during 1967, and he had the stammering speech, and he did all these things, and the country won the war. Why? Because the prime minister doesn't determine the future of the country. The country is made up of many, many different functions. If you look at the Israel Democracy Institute's they put it out every year, the Israel Democracy Index, the most highly trusted organization, entity, whatever, in Israel, more than the Supreme Court, more than the Prime Minister, more than the Knesset, more than any, is the army. Yes. And that, by the way, also ranks very high when they poll Israeli Arabs, much higher than the Prime Minister, than the Knesset, than whatever. My point is, Israel's security is going to be protected by the army. You don't need a prime minister with a certain amount of experience to do that work. That's what the hundreds and the generals are all doing. What you need, it seems to me, is what all three of these men had, and I can include, other women as well if we were looking at other people. They all had a passion for the people of Israel, and they had a passion for a vision for what the state is. There are people out there that have it. I'm not saying that they are the people that you would necessarily go gaga about to run the country, but Yair Lapid has a vision for the country. I actually think that, and he's supposed to be pretty much a straight shooter and clean as far as anybody can tell. Avi Gabbai, simply by virtue of his story, he grew up in the neighborhood that I live in. But the neighborhood that I live in, which has now become gentrified, was a poor neighborhood of Mizrahi Jews. He was, I think, one of 8 children, if I'm not mistaken, who pulled himself up by his bootstraps and became the head of Bezek. That, in and of itself, to have a Mizrahi prime minister who was born into a poor family, who's not religious, but who, like Begin, is very comfortable in the religious world, would speak volumes to the Mizrahim and to Israelis about what this country could be. Is he tried and tested in a whole array of ways? No, he's not. Did Yair Lapid get tricked by Bibi Netanyahu and do a terrible job? He did. But again, none of these people are going to be perfect. But the notion that when we think about the prime minister, what we need is a person who can solve all of Israel's problems, it seems to me the trap that gets us to not be able to think widely. We need a person who models the best of what Israel can be, and the professionals will take care of a lot of the rest of the work.
I just want to make one comment, and it was said before. The graveyards are full of people that had not replacement. So please remember that. And I'm sure that Israel can find another leader, not a corrupt one.
Okay. We will have to take now very quickly the remaining questions and then allow the panelists to answer whatever they choose. Oh, and sorry, we have one here. Yeah.
I never can answer a question that a couple of my Christian friends have asked me. And having the three of you here is wonderful for me for that reason. And I don't know what the year was when the Israelis shot at an American ship and killed
67.
During the Six-Day War.
Was it? Yeah, and killed
the Liberty.
Yes.
Yeah, killed many American sailors, and we never heard much about that after that. And I can't answer the question why Israel did that.
Okay, we'll get an answer. The Liberty. Yes.
I don't know.
Yes. So speaking about Altalena. You depict a situation of great divisiveness in Israeli society, which to me reflects a lot about what's the situation today. And I'm wondering, how was that resolved in the past, and maybe we could take a few lessons for the present.
Great question. Thank you.
This question for the ambassador. You mentioned that Rabin was behind the polls of Netanyahu in his last years of life. So what were Rabin's political errors at that time, and what could he have done differently to hold the center?
Oh, wow. Thank you. That's a deep one. Yes.
Okay. So much of the discussion thus far, which has been highly enlightening, has been focusing on Israel's confrontations with mostly Arab threats. But my question is in regards to Begin's and then Rabin's response to the rise of a distinctly non-Arab threat, though many of its proxies were Arab. How did Begin respond to the Iranian Revolution, and how did Rabin confront and combat Hezbollah in Lebanon and its backers, and what would the meaning of this grand strategy be for future Israeli policymakers today?
Great. So the Iranian threat, and how did Begin, especially with the revolution? So now I have the task of asking the panel to answer anything they choose, since you don't have much time, and I apologize for that. But they will be around. I'm now volunteering their time, and you can ask them follow-up questions.
The divisiveness one?
Okay, go ahead.
I actually think it's a great question. My own take, obviously Israel's a very divided society. So is the United States. And if you were to ask me which is the society about which I'm more bullish, I'm much more bullish about Israel. Not because it has an outside enemy, though that sometimes helps. No, I'm serious. That's 100% serious. But fundamentally, I think that Israel, not every single cluster to be sure, but fundamentally there is a sense of tremendous pride in the project and a recognition, religious or secular, young or old, rich or poor, maybe not Haredi, we have to have that. And the Haredim, by the way, are like anybody else. They come in very different forms and shapes and sizes, and they don't all believe the same thing. Any more than what Democrats think about something or what Christians think about something, Haredim don't all think the same thing about things generally, so we shouldn't tar them all with the same brush. But leaving them aside, fundamentally my sense of Israeli society is that it is unified by a profound both pride in, belief in, and commitment to the continuing flourishing of the Jewish people by virtue of there being a secure, democratic Jewish state. How to achieve that, we're very divided. What I think is happening here, and obviously it's a different night, different question, is that the notion of an American people is beginning to unravel. In other words, it was a pretense, because African Americans were never really part of the American people as far as many whites were concerned, and so on and so on and so forth. And I think that America is facing actually a much more difficult challenge to have a leader that will actually be able to bring people back together under one vision. So Israel is very divided, you're right, but I am actually extremely bullish and optimistic about the next decades of the country, as long as, I wouldn't even say great, as long as adequate leaders are found.
May I?
1 second,
just a small remark. I hear American Jews worried about the future of Israel. I must tell you, we are there to stay. We are not going anywhere. And we are talking about a state that is bigger than all the Baltic states together, that is as big as Holland. So we are not the tiny state that we were in 48 or even in 67. So please stop talking about us as if we are a project that is bound to fail.
ITAMAR.
Quick answers to some of the questions. One, where are the substitutes politically? They exist, but they're not in politics, because being in politics today with the prying media and the need to raise money and so forth, lots of people choose not to be in politics, could have been great leaders. But my second word, Macron. Where was the president of France a year before he became president of France? Who knew? Well, so, they exist. We need not worry about that. Second, Liberty in 1967, it was an espionage ship monitoring Israeli communication, concealing its identity, and by mistake, the Israeli Air Force thought it was an Egyptian ship and sank it, unfortunately. Many, by the way, were Jews on the boat because they needed to know Hebrew to listen to Israeli communication. Now, Rabin and Iran, simply, one of the main reasons that Rabin wanted to sign the Oslo Accord and to make peace with Syria was that he identified that the main danger was in the east, in Iran. And he said, we need to sort out our immediate neighborhood in order to deal with the bigger challenge in the east.
Thank you. I want to do 4 announcements. One, the winner of our debate is Golda Meir. So congratulations to Golda. Second, a huge thank you to Peter, to Susie, to everyone. It's really an honor for all of us. And please join me in thanking 3 luminaries. It's what an honor for me as well. Thank you all.
Thank you to our distinguished guest. That was an absolutely fascinating panel and discussion. And thank you to NATAN for expertly navigating us through this conversation. I want to thank you all also for your participation this evening and for phenomenal questions. And we want to encourage your participation in the work ahead. We will be in touch in the days ahead about programs, both private and public, happening in the coming weeks. And we welcome your involvement in the work to come. As you leave, you can pick up a bag with all 3 of the books this evening, either on your exit on the way out or here in the corner as you see the bags in the corner. Thank you all once again, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.